Beneath the windswept plains of southeastern Turkey lies a secret that rewrote the story of human civilization. For thousands of years, the world believed it knew where it all began. Mesopotamia, the cradle of cities, writing, and kings. But in the late 20th century, archaeologists uncovered something that didn't fit any timeline. A place so ancient, it made the pyramids seem modern, and so mysterious that even today, no one fully understands who built it or why. Imagine standing on a sunburnt hill where time itself seems frozen. Stones the size of men rise from the earth in perfect circles, carved with animals that no longer roam this land. Vultures, lions, serpents, their figures etched with precision by hands that shouldn't have had the tools or the knowledge to create such forms. This isn't a ruin of a known kingdom. There are no houses, no writing, no pottery. Only towering monoliths arranged with deliberate order, as if marking the dawn of consciousness itself. The site has a name now, Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill. But for nearly 12,000 years, it lay buried beneath layers of soil, completely forgotten by the people who came after. When it was finally unearthed, the world's archaeologists were stunned. Its radiocarbon dating placed it at around 9600 BCE, over 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 before the pyramids, and long before the first cities of Mesopotamia. This discovery shattered everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization. How could hunter-gatherers, without farming or metal, design something so complex, so purposeful? And then, perhaps the most haunting mystery of all, it wasn't destroyed by time or war. It was intentionally buried, as if its creators wanted to seal it away from the world, a time capsule of humanity's forgotten origin. This is the story of a city older than any known empire, a sacred monument that predates history itself, and the mystery of the people who built it, then vanished into silence.
Imagine the world not as nations and capitals, but as an endless sweep of tundra, steppe, and scrub, a planet still catching its breath after the last great ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, glaciers that once gripped continents were retreating. Rivers swelled with meltwater, coastlines shifted, and a changing climate rewired the maps humans had inherited. With that slow, indifferent rearrangement of the Earth, the stage was set for something that would quietly, irreversibly, change what it meant to be human. For most of our species' history, people lived in small, mobile bands. They followed herds, fished river bends, collected roots and seasonal fruits. Their world was shaped by the rhythms of migration, daylight, and weather. Communities were flexible by necessity. Mobility meant survival. Toolkits were portable, crafted from bone, flint, antler, and a careful economy of materials. Social life was intimate. Knowledge was passed orally between elders and children around fires. Yet within this roaming life, there were already the seeds of transformation, subtle shifts in behavior that over centuries would lead away from wandering and toward staying. The first whispers of sedentism come from the Levant, a narrow arc of fertile land that stretches from the eastern Mediterranean into the highlands of modern-day Turkey and northern Syria. Here, some groups began to linger near reliable water sources and patches of wild grains. The archaeological fingerprint of this change is unmistakable: grinding stones for processing wild cereals, storage pits for seeds, buried dead in places that were revisited repeatedly. These are the faint human-made traces of a new logic, one that weighed the benefits of staying against the risks of movement. Archaeologists call one of the most striking cultures of this transition the Natufian. Flourishing roughly between 12,500 and 9,500 BCE, the Natufians occupied caves and open-air sites across the Levant. They were not farmers in the modern sense, but neither were they purely nomadic. Their settlements show semi-permanent structures, low stone foundations, hearths and storage, and a growing reliance on wild cereals, which they harvested seasonally. They left behind abundant art and burial practices that suggest complex social identities, burials with grave goods, human skulls modified or plastered later, symbolic objects placed with the dead. These are early signs of ritual, remembrance, and a sense of place. It was a time of experiments. People learned the seasons of particular grains, how to harvest them efficiently, how to process tough husks. They cached surplus in pits and possibly transported it when needed. With time, repeated interaction with specific plant species created selection pressures, the tiny, invisible nudges that would eventually produce domesticated wheat and barley. But domestication is not an instant event. It unfolds across generations, seeds saved, sown near camps, plants selected unintentionally for favorable traits. The process blurred the line between human and wild, between choice and adaptation. This slow alchemy of environment, habit, and necessity accelerated around climactic tipping points. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions between approximately 10,900 and 9,600 BCE, was a dramatic, destabilizing episode. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted, and the availability of familiar food sources was disrupted. For groups eking out a living from precarious ecosystems, the Younger Dryas would have been a brutal test. Archaeological patterns suggest that when old foodways became unreliable, people doubled down on predictable resources. Where previously mobility offered resilience, increasing reliance on local resources and stored surplus became an adaptive advantage. It is in this crucible, the late Natufian and the post-Younger Dryas period, that we see the emergence of the pre-pottery Neolithic, often shortened to PPNA and PPNB. These terms describe a suite of technological, economic, and social innovations across the Fertile Crescent between roughly 10,000 and 7,000 BCE. Houses became more permanent, communities clustered into larger aggregates. Specialized tools for planting, harvesting, and grinding proliferated. And along with practical changes came a cultural reorientation. People invested emotional and spiritual energy in specific places.
We do not yet find kings or palaces in these early villages. Hierarchies, where present, were subtle and local. But the archaeological record shows increasing labor investment, larger structures, communal works, and evidence of coordinated activities that required planning and cooperation. Villages like Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements known to archaeology, began to appear as recognizable nuclei of human life. Jericho's earliest monumental features, including defensive walls and a distinctive stone tower, suggest communities capable of mobilizing substantial workforces for collective projects. These constructions tell us something essential. People were willing to labor not only to survive, but to shape their landscape for reasons tied to identity, security, and meaning. This period also reveals an intensification of symbolic life. Objects with no immediate subsistence function, figurines, carved stone stelae, elaborate burials, become more common. These artifacts are not decorative afterthoughts, they are social glue. Rituals bind groups together, encode memory, and help manage cooperation at scales larger than intimate bands. Shared myths and sacred places can coordinate behavior and establish claims to territory. In short, belief systems and material culture co-evolved to make denser social life possible. Importantly, these ritual behaviors sometimes precede full-scale agriculture. For decades, archaeologists assumed that farming came first, and complex ritual architecture followed once surplus and permanent settlement made it feasible. But the evidence complicates that tidy sequence. In several early sites, communities invested heavily in communal ritual spaces, structures that required organization and labor, even before there is clear evidence of fully domesticated crops or animals. This suggests that social and religious developments were not simply byproducts of agriculture. They were active drivers of social change, possibly even catalysts for cultivation and sedentism. Across the broader landscape, networks of contact spread ideas and technologies. Exchange of obsidian, beads, and other valuables knit remote groups into diffuse webs of interaction. People shared not only goods, but also analogous rituals and architectural forms. This regional conversation meant that innovations in one place could ripple outward, accelerating cultural evolution across the Near East. At the human scale, daily life in these nascent communities was both harder and richer than we often imagine. Families rose with the light to tend hearths, crack grain, mend tools. Children learned plant calendars and how to read the weather. Elders told stories, oral maps of memory that named ancestors, narrated origins, and encoded practical knowledge. Work was interlaced with ritual. Feasts marked seasonal milestones. Burial rites affirmed bonds, and shared constructions of stone and timber physically inscribed a community's permanence onto the landscape. Places accumulated layers of meaning, and humans, in turn, became attached to places. But permanence had costs. Sedentism made people more visible to enemies and disease. Reliance on a narrow set of crops exposed communities to climatic shocks. As populations aggregated, social tensions likely rose. Disputes over land, access to water, and roles in production and ritual. These pressures would, in turn, shape new institutions and hierarchies. It is in this shifting world, where ritual intensifies, where communities experiment with cultivation, where landscapes are slowly remade by human hands, that the architectural anomalies of the era become less bewildering. Large-scale communal works, monumental stones, and complex symbolic ensembles are not simply signs of proto-urban life. They are evidence of a deeper social calculus. People were learning to coordinate at scales that their mobile ancestors rarely needed. They were rehearsing the mechanics of what city life would later require: pooled labor, leadership, shared beliefs, and durable investments in place. Within the arc of these transformations, Anatolia's high plateaus and the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent play a crucial and underappreciated role. The topography, a mosaic of uplands, river valleys, and resource patches, made certain places natural foci for repeated gatherings. Seasonal aggregation of groups for feasts, trade, or ritual could have transformed temporary meeting spots into permanent sanctuaries. Over time, repeated ritual activity deposits debris and cultural material, raising the ground level and creating the strata future archaeologists would later find. Layers of human visitation turned into palimpsests of memory. This is the whisper before the roar, a slow, messy, adaptive movement away from pure mobility towards rootedness. The archaeological remains are fragmentary: stone tools, hearths, charred seeds, and carefully placed bones, but they tell a coherent story. Human beings, responding to climatic stress, social opportunity, and spiritual yearning, began to invest in place. They began to imagine themselves as inhabitants of particular landscapes, not merely as passers-by. Our narrative moves now from this broad landscape of change to a single, startling set of stones on a Turkish hilltop.
These stones do not simply belong to the same arc of change, they confound it. For while many settlements gradually accumulated ritual and architecture, there exists a site that seems to invert the expected order. Monumental, symbolic architecture erected with painstaking care at a time when full agricultural economies were still nascent. Those pillars, the animal carvings, the arranged enclosures, they are the next audacious sentence in a story that had been whispering for generations.
The hill sat like a punctuation mark on the Anatolian plateau, unremarkable at a distance, a low rise of pale limestone that winter winds scoured clean. For millennia, shepherds passed over it without noticing anything more than a convenient place to rest. Maps marked it as another dot in a vast landscape. Yet what lay beneath that unassuming topsoil would force historians and archaeologists to rewrite an entire chapter of human history. The first modern eyes that casually recorded the site, field surveyors and regional maps, left the hill's stones to time. Only when more focused archaeological work moved into the region in the late 20th century did the significance begin to reveal itself. In the early 1990s, an excavation team realized the soil of that hill preserved something extraordinary. Worked stone, carved motifs, the shadows of pillars rising from the earth. What had looked like scattered surface fragments were the visible tips of a far larger puzzle. Serious excavation began, and as layers were peeled back, a sequence of surprises emerged. One revelation after another, each more disorienting than the last. What archaeologists uncovered were carved limestone pillars arranged into deliberate enclosures, monumental, vertical monoliths set in rhythmic order, most often in circular plans. Many of the pillars were T-shaped, broad shoulders tapering into narrower shafts, rising like stylized human silhouettes frozen in stone. Some of these pillars towered over researchers, reaching heights of 3, 4, even 5 meters. Some weighed many tons and had been quarried, shaped, and hauled into place with a care and engineering skill that would have taxed later Bronze Age builders. The faces of the pillars were not blank. They bore deep reliefs, predators and prey, birds with wings spread, serpents coiled, abstract symbols and panels of repeated motifs. The art was vivid, almost alive in its realism and motion. The sheer scale of the work was the first shock. Monumental architecture, stone raised to commemorate, to shelter, to assert, was a hallmark of later civilizations. For centuries, archaeologists had pictured a pretty tidy sequence. Plant domestication gave food surplus. Surplus supported sedentary villages. Villages accumulated social complexity. Social complexity produced specialists who could command the labor to build temples and monuments. But here, on that hill, the sequence seemed inverted. Monumental stonework predated clear evidence of extensive farming or the kinds of permanent settlements that, by conventional logic, should have supplied the labor and the means for such projects. Radiocarbon dates from the organic matter trapped in the layers around the pillars placed the earliest construction firmly in the pre-Holocene world, roughly around the 10th millennium BCE. At those dates, societies across the region where evidence survived appeared to be in transition, hanging between mobile foraging and emerging sedentarism. Yet the architecture at this site was unmistakably deliberate and organized. It required quarrying, transportation of heavy stone, an understanding of load and balance, and coordinated labor. Whoever organized this work had authority, influence, or a powerful shared motive that could bend small bands to a collective project. The other startling feature was what the site lacked.
where dwellings accumulate domestic debris, hearths layered with ash, middens of pottery and food refuse, neat rows of clay vessels. This hill produced curiously little domestic clutter. There were no extensive arrays of homes, no kilns, very little pottery in the earliest layers. Instead, excavation revealed evidence that hinted at repeated, intense gatherings, concentrations of animal bone, smashed stone tools, burned plant remains, and ash deposits that suggest episodes of feasting. Whole species of wild game appear in abundance, gazelle and other animals that tell a story of mass procurement, processing, and consumption on a scale unusual for small bands. In short, this was a place of performance and ritual as much as construction. Interpreting what those rituals meant proved difficult. The carved animals, vultures, foxes, boars, snakes, and ducks, were depicted with remarkable vivacity. Some of the pillars bore anthropomorphic forms, stylized torsos and arms, but no full facial depictions. A few reliefs showed scenes that hinted at violence or ritualized anatomical absence, headless human shapes, or figures with dismembered parts. The array of images read like a visual library of myth and memory, a symbolic catalog of concerns that mattered to the builders: death, predation, the sky, the underworld. To hold these motifs up to the light is to sense a complex cosmology being encoded onto stone. The T-pillars themselves provoked speculation. Many researchers interpret their shape as anthropomorphic, stylized human figures whose height and broad shoulders suggest the presence of beings larger than life. Some of the pillars were intentionally sunk into benches or robbed platforms, arranged so that the shoulders faced inward toward open spaces. When modern teams excavated multiple enclosures, the pattern repeated, concentric rings of pillars framing a communal center. In that center, archaeologists sometimes found smaller stones, benches, and what looked like deliberately set focal points, places where people might stand, speak, perform, or place votive objects. It was the scale of labor, the vividness of the imagery, and the focused absence of domestic debris that drove the central question: who were these people? The material assemblage implied organizations beyond a single household. The logistical challenge of quarrying and moving massive slabs implies coordinated planning and sustained effort. But the absence of clear agricultural infrastructure, no fields, no domesticated animal bones in the earliest strata, and a scarcity of pottery argues against a picture of a densely settled economy supporting full-time laborers. The contradiction was the site's greatest contribution. It forced archaeologists to reimagine the social possibilities of late hunter-gatherer communities. Excavations also revealed a surprising technical sophistication. The pillars were not rough-hewn lumps. They had been carefully selected from local limestone outcrops, shaped to a consistent form, and often finely pecked and smoothed. The motifs carved into their surfaces displayed a confident hand. Artists, perhaps specialists, capable of controlled relief work and symbolic consistency. Quarry marks and tool impressions suggest the use of hammerstones and chisels, and the choice of imagery appears to follow a shared iconographic program. This consistency implies not only technical expertise, but also a cultural vocabulary that circulated among groups, an agreed-upon set of symbols and meanings that participants would have understood.
As the excavations progressed, more nuanced data emerged from careful sieving and analysis. Micro-residues on tool surfaces, pollen trapped in hearths, and isotopic study of animal bones painted a layered portrait of activity. The faunal assemblage revealed intense hunting episodes. Cut marks and percussion breaks on bones show systematic butchery,
an economy organized around mass processing rather than the casual hunting of scattered prey. Burn patterns and hearth composition hinted at large, organized meals. Seeds and charred plant remains pointed to the gathering and processing of wild cereals. All of this suggests cyclical events, seasonal aggregations where dozens, perhaps hundreds of people converged to eat, to create, to bury memory in stone. And then came the question that riveted public imagination. Should this site be called a city? That label is provocative and, to many specialists, misleading. The pillars and enclosures are monumental, but they lack the configuration of urbanism: houses, streets, waste systems, craft production zones, and the steady accretion of domestic life that defines a city. Calling the site a city risks imposing later categories on an era when those categories did not yet exist. Many scholars prefer ritual center or sanctuary, terms that capture the non-domestic intensity of the place. Yet the language of the public and the drama of the discovery pushed toward bigger claims. The site felt like a seed of urban potential, an architectural expression of a social scale larger than household, but not yet full urbanism. Perhaps more perplexing was the site's decision to end its monumental life in an act that still puzzles researchers: deliberate burial. After centuries, maybe generations, of building and use, the enclosures were covered over in a manner that looked intentional and systematic. Layers of stone, soil, and fill were deposited over the monuments, sealing them from the living world. The burial was not random collapse or gradual sedimentation. It bore the fingerprints of choice: carefully tamped fills, stones set to cover column bases, and a stratigraphy that suggested conscious internment. Why would a community expend the labor to construct such elaborate architecture and then deliberately bury it? The act reads like ritual closure or perhaps a defensive strategy, but its precise meaning remains contested. When news of the excavation reached the wider public, reactions ranged from scholarly astonishment to sensational headlines. Here was a place constructed by people we had long assumed were too mobile, too small scale, and too resource limited to produce such stone, with a set of monumental gestures that seemed to anticipate the age of cities. It forced a re-examination of causality. Maybe ritual and communal gathering produced the social glue necessary for agriculture and settled life, rather than the other way around. The presence of mass feasting, shared symbolism, and large-scale labor suggests that complex social institutions can emerge in hunter-gatherer contexts under the right conditions. Beyond academic debates, the discovery carried an emotional weight. Standing among the pillars, archaeologists and visitors reported a powerful sense of presence, as if they were in a place where people had come together across generations to confront big questions. Who are we? What happens when we die? How does the world beyond the human look back at us? The carved vultures and snakes, the empty benches, the echo of ancient voices, these elements combined to create a liminal space where the past pressed on the present. The site became, in short, an archaeological Rorschach test. For some, it proved the endurance of ritual as a driver of social complexity. For others, it was an exceptional, localized phenomenon that should not overturn broader models of agrarian-oriented urbanism. New analytical techniques, refined radiocarbon calibration, microanalysis of residues, and comparative studies across the region began to feed the debate. But whatever the interpretive outcome, the unambiguous fact remained. This hill held monumental intentions designed and executed by people living at a time long before the established markers of civilization. In the excavation trenches, under the careful shading of archaeologists' tarps, the pillars kept their silent testimony. They were at once the greatest clue and the deepest enigma of the site. Each carved animal, every smooth shoulder of limestone, whispered of hands that took time to make their marks. Those hands had organized labor, mobilized resources, invented iconography, and finally sealed their work below the soil, as if to tell a story only the earth could keep. The discovery had not only added a new site to the map of prehistory, it ruptured familiar narratives about how humans moved from survival to society. It suggested that the impulse to gather, to commemorate, and to bind memory in stone might be as old as, or even older than, the impulse to plow fields. And in that unsettling inversion lay the beginning of a new understanding. The archaeological record was not merely a ledger of technological progress. It was the fossilized drama of humans negotiating identity, memory, and the invisible scaffolding of belief. From the quiet hilltop where the first stones had been raised, to the laboratories where samples were dated and images analyzed, the implications spread like ripples. The world that once thought it knew the origin story of civilization found itself listening to a different narrative, one where pilgrimage, performance, and the requiem of ritual could coax people into cooperative feats that would in time reconfigure their relationship with the land. The discovery had opened a door, not to easy conclusions, but to a new set of questions that archaeologists, historians, and the public would pursue for decades to come. And so, having unearthed a monument built before the first cities, we must now ask how and why the hands that raised those stones conceived of such a thing in the first place. What beliefs, pressures, and aspirations produced this monument to collective time? The answers lie buried in a constellation of clues: the carvings, the bones, the charred seeds, and the scars in the stone. To understand them, we must move closer, into the lives of the people who planned, quarried, carved, and gathered under those pillars.
Who could have imagined that the hands which raised those enormous stone pillars belonged to people we once pictured as wandering bands, living day to day with bone and flint? The question is not simply archaeological curiosity, it forces us to remake the mental image of late Pleistocene life. To answer it, we must triangulate evidence from stone, bone, charcoal, and space, then read between the lines to reconstruct social rhythms that left no written records. What emerges is a portrait of ingenuity, cooperation, and cultural ambition that defies the tidy categories archaeologists once relied upon. First, the logistical reality. Quarrying, shaping, transporting, erecting, these are not casual tasks. Many of the pillars were hewn from local limestone outcrops, but to reduce a multi-ton block to a polished anthropomorphic shaft requires time, skill, and tools. The tool marks preserved in weathered stone show repeated pecking and smoothing with hard hammerstones and chisels. The surfaces were finished, edges were planed, motifs were deliberately composed. Transporting pillars, some weighing several tons, across even modest distances and setting them upright in prepared sockets implies chains of labor and knowledge of levers, ropes, ramps, or sledges. These are complex logistical puzzles that imply planning, coordination, and an ability to mobilize manpower for specific purposes. Mobilization implies motivation. Why would people who still relied heavily on wild resources concentrate labor at this scale? The evidence points toward ritual and social cohesion. The site's deposits contain repeated episodes of mass feasting, dense accumulations of animal bone with butchery marks, large hearths, and copious debris consistent with communal meals. Feasting is not merely consumption, it is social currency. In foraging societies, large communal feasts often consolidate alliances, reaffirm obligations, redistribute food, and create obligations of reciprocity.
They are situations in which prestige can be earned and political networks forged. A single person or household cannot produce the logistical surplus needed for such events alone. Feasts presuppose networks that pool resources across groups and seasons. That pooling suggests a different social geometry than simple localized family bands. The builders likely belonged to a regional system of groups that aggregated seasonally. Imagine upland hunting bands who, at certain times of year, converged on a particular place, a natural amphitheater, a hill, a water source, to feast, exchange goods, marry, and perform rites. These gatherings could swell the population temporarily from a few dozen to several hundred. It is during those gatherings that the labor for monumental tasks could be organized: quarrying in the off-season, communal transport during aggregation, and ritual activities timed to those meetings. In other words, the social scale needed for construction existed, but it was episodic, not permanent. Within these gatherings, specialists likely emerged. The carvings on the pillars is not crude, it shows practiced hands and consistent iconography. That consistency suggests knowledge transmission, and possibly full-time or seasonal artisans who learned the repertoire and techniques. If some individuals shaping stone or in producing iconography, they would be cultural repositories, keepers of style, myth, and ritual knowledge. Similarly, organizers, people who could coordinate logistics, direct labor, plan feasts, collect and distribute resources, would gain prestige and influence. Such roles do not require palace bureaucracy. They can exist as fluid positions of authority embedded in ritual charisma. The person who presides over a ceremony, the elder with authority to call feasts, the craftsperson whose prestige rests on unique skill. Religious or ritual leadership is a useful model here. Ritual specialists, shamans, ritual elders, or priest-like figures appear in many ethnographic analogs as organizers of large ceremonies. They marshal attention, direct sacrificial activities, and codify symbolic programs. The iconography at the site, vultures, snakes, large predators, headless human forms, reads like a concentrated religious lexicon. These repeated motifs would have been legible to participants. They encoded shared narratives about death, power, the animal world, and the cosmos. People who could interpret and manipulate these symbols would accrue social capital. In short, the social engine for construction could be religious authority coupled with episodic aggregation. Yet authority here likely differed radically from later institutionalized hierarchies. There is little evidence for the kind of inequality that leaves clear archaeological traces: massive elite residences, exclusive luxury goods, or differential burial wealth on a huge scale. Instead, prestige may have been situational and negotiable. Festival leaders, ritual performers, and artisans could gain influence during events but remain embedded in reciprocal networks. Leadership might have been charismatic and situational rather than hereditary or bureaucratic. That said, sustained organization across decades, if not centuries, suggests mechanisms to transmit knowledge and authority across generations, perhaps through ritual apprenticeship, kin relationships, or marriage ties. The site's material culture also reveals ecological savvy. Faunal remains show people targeted specific species in coordinated hunts, gazelles and other herd animals, then transported carcasses for communal butchery. The butchery marks indicate systematic processing: meat removal, marrow extraction, and distribution. Pools of burnt bone and charred fat point to large roasting and communal preparation. Botanical remains, charred seeds, and processed plant residues show intensive use of wild cereals and tubers. These activities reveal knowledge of seasonal cycles and an ability to exploit peak resource moments. That knowledge made pooling worthwhile. By harvesting at peak moments and preserving or sharing surpluses, groups could create the short-term abundance required to support monumental labor and elaborate ritual. Another intriguing dimension is possible astronomical awareness. Some researchers have argued that certain pillar alignments and iconographic sequences may relate to celestial observations, seasonal sunrises, prominent stars, or constellations. If correct, this implies not only ritual performance, but a calendrical logic that coordinated activity across the year. In hunter-gatherer contexts, celestial markers often function as mnemonic devices for seasonal rounds, signals to gather, hunt, or plant. Whether the carved panels are an explicit star map is debated, but the broader point is less about precise astronomy than about temporal orientation. The builders were deeply attuned to seasonal rhythms and may have encoded those rhythms into their sacred architecture to coordinate gatherings and labor.
Material evidence also suggests specialized technologies. Residues of hafted tools, sophisticated bone implements, and finely pecked stone points reflect refined craft traditions. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated plausible techniques for moving heavy stones using simple machines, ramps, log rollers, sledges, and cooperative hauling. The presence of prepared sockets and platform beds in some enclosures indicates engineering foresight. Stones were set in stable foundations, with benches and recesses designed for human activity. These are not ad hoc arrangements. They are designed spaces organized for repeated use and performance. A crucial part of the puzzle is the intentional burial of the site after its period of use. Why would a community that invested such effort deliberately inter their monument? The answer likely lies in ritual closure. Many societies ritually decommission sacred spaces when their cosmologies change, when leadership shifts, or when the social logic that sustained a site dissolves. Burial can serve to protect sacred objects, to mark an endpoint in a mythic narrative, or to transform a place into a monument of memory for future generations. Burial may also reflect ecological change. If the area became less hospitable due to climatic shifts, groups may have chosen to bury and retire the site rather than maintain it. The very act of burial and organized disposal attests again to coordinated labor and shared decisions about communal memory. Debates about a centralized workforce versus a networked seasonal labor force persist because the archaeological signatures can support both readings depending on interpretive emphasis. The more conservative model posits highly organized seasonal gatherings, regional networks of kin groups pooling labor, capable of monumental works without permanent urban life. The more revisionist model suggests that the social structures required for such labor are a kind of proto-complexity, quasi-permanent institutions of ritual organizers, specialist artisans, and emergent leadership that foreshadow bureaucratic forms. Both models agree on the behavioral facts. They differ on whether the emergent institutions constituted proto-states or were nonetheless embedded in egalitarian fluid social fabrics. Genetic and isotopic studies of burials in regional contemporary sites add nuance. Evidence of wide-ranging mobility, diverse diets, and intergroup mating suggest that populations were not isolated. Exchange networks of obsidian, beads, and exotic materials tell of far-reaching connections. Such networks facilitate information flow. They are the arteries through which iconography, ritual practice, and technical knowledge travel. The builders were not an isolated anomaly. They partook in a dynamic regional milieu where ideas, people, and goods moved across landscapes. We must also account for cognitive and symbolic leaps. Monumentality is, at heart, a communicative act. It broadcasts shared values and creates durable claims to meaning. The act of chiseling stone into an anthropomorphic form is a statement. We will commit memory to the landscape. The particular iconography, predators, scavengers, dismembered human forms, suggests a community tackling mortality, predation pressures, and social risk.
The rituals performed in these enclosures probably provided frameworks for social cohesion, ways to mourn, to celebrate victories, to sanction alliances, and to teach cosmology to new generations. Finally, we should not romanticize or oversimplify the builders into a single category. They were pragmatic, creative, adaptive people who married ecological knowledge with social imagination. They were hunters who could coordinate mass hunts and butchery. They were ritualists who could compose and perform complex ceremonies. They were artisans who mastered stone and symbol. They were organizers who could call gatherings and move tons of rock. In short, they were fully human, capable of triviality and genius, of pettiness and profound communal vision. Understanding the builders is not about giving them modern titles, chiefs, priests, or engineers, but about recognizing the functional roles and social processes that made their achievements possible. Monumental architecture does not require a state, but it does require people with incentives to cooperate beyond the immediate household, mechanisms to coordinate labor, and cultural narratives powerful enough to sustain multi-generational projects. The pillars on that hill are a record of those mechanisms, stone pages in a book whose sentences we are only beginning to decode. As we leave the scaffolds of quarry marks and step back from the carved faces, one image persists. People assembled beneath the cold sky, hands raw from work, voices raised in song or prayer, animals roasting on spits, and leaders and artisans guiding each stroke of the chisel. They are at once ordinary and extraordinary, our ancestors who chose to shape stone into collective memory. To know them is to see the origin of organized imagination, the moment when humans chose to make the landscape itself a page for their most essential questions.
When you stand among those carved pillars, the first, simplest reaction is to stop translating and start listening. The animals are not mere decoration. The stone speaks in a concentrated, repeated vocabulary. Vultures wheel above headless torsos. Snakes coil along legs. Foxes, boars, scorpions, and ducks move across faces in a grammar that repeats enclosure after enclosure. Those images are the closest thing we have to a language from a people who left no script. A visual grammar designed to be read aloud in ceremonies and remembered across generations. But what does it mean? Scholars have approached the carvings from many angles: mythic, ritual, ecological, and even astronomical. And the safest claim is this: the reliefs encode a set of recurring concerns: death, predation, seasonal threat and protection, bodily integrity or its absence, and the boundary between sky and earth appear again and again. The patterns are too consistent and too deliberate to be pure ornament. They are messages. One of the most haunting compositions appears on the famous Pillar 43, sometimes called the vulture stone. A vulture is carved in striking detail, wings poised, carrying or hovering over an object, and beneath it a headless human torso. Some interpreters read this scene as a literal depiction of excarnation, the practice of leaving the dead exposed for scavengers, allowing birds to strip flesh as part of a funerary rite. Vultures in many ethnographic contexts are agents of transformation. They consume the body and thereby help release the soul. Viewed this way, the stone may be a visual record of a mortuary economy in which birds mediated between human and spirit. But other readings are equally plausible. The vulture may be a symbol of purification, a totemic protector, or part of a mythic tale in which a bird carries the soul to the sky. Some researchers suggest the rounded object associated with the vulture could be a head, a sun disk, or a symbolic ball representing an idea of life force. The ambiguity is precisely the point. The stones compress multiple layers of meaning: literal mortuary practice, cosmological metaphor, and coded social memory into imagery that could be read differently by different ritual participants or at different moments in a life cycle. Headless human forms and the presence of isolated skull motifs introduce another strand: the body as a locus of contested meaning. In the broader pre-pottery Neolithic world, including nearby Levantine sites, archaeologists have documented deliberate treatment of skulls, removal from burials, plastering and modeling of faces, and redeposition in domestic or ritual contexts. These plastered skulls are often taken as evidence for ancestor veneration, a way to keep the dead among the living, to maintain social memory, to anchor claims to lineage or place. Although the best-known plastered skulls come from sites like Jericho and Ain Ghazal rather than the hill itself, their existence in the regional cultural horizon suggests a shared set of practices and anxieties about death and identity. The carved headless figures at the site may be part of that same conversation, a monumentalized reflection on life, death, and the ways communities manage the boundary between them. Animal imagery complicates the picture further. Predators, foxes, large felids, boar, are frequently male in depiction and often portrayed aggressively. This has prompted ideas of sympathetic magic or apotropaic images. Show the predator to control the predator, depict the danger to neutralize it. At other moments, the animals seem to act in narrative scenes, predator and prey juxtaposed, sequences that might encode mythic anecdotes or seasonal cycles of hunting and scarcity. Some scholars argue the animals are totems, clan emblems, linking particular kin groups to an animal identity and using the stone architecture to assert social networks and obligations. A provocative thread in recent scholarship proposes that parts of the iconography served calendrical or astronomical functions. Certain pillar panels have been read as symbolic markers of seasonal events, constellations, heliacal risings, or meteor showers that might have signaled cycles of aggregation, hunting, or ritual. Proponents of this view argue that encoding a celestial calendar on stone allowed widely dispersed groups to coordinate seasonal gatherings and labor. Critics, however, caution that such astronomical interpretations can easily overreach. Apparent alignments may be coincidental or post hoc readings imposed by modern observers. The case for a coherent, systematic star map is contested. Some analyses find intriguing correlations, while more cautious scholarship warns against mapping modern constellational ideas onto Neolithic visual culture without stronger corroboration. The debate is alive and reflects the broader tension between symbolic richness and the limits of archaeological inference.
Beyond death and sky, the stones also seem to stage drama, scenes that may rehearse social anxieties. One recurring motif is bodily fragmentation: headless torsos, dismembered limbs, exaggerated genitalia. These figures may relate to rites of passage, punitive rituals, fertility symbolism, or mythic narratives about cosmogenesis. Ethnographic parallels offer hints. Many cultures perform staged violence in ritual contexts to negotiate social order, to ritually kill and rebirth leaders, or to dramatize cosmological battles between order and chaos. If the pillars encoded such dramas, they serve not only as instruction, but as social infrastructure, scripts for large-scale ceremonial performances that coordinated behavior, transmitted norms, and dramatized group identity. The material context supports the idea of performance. Excavations reveal concentrated deposits consistent with episodic, intense gatherings, piles of butchered animal bone, hearths, smashed grinding stones, and traces of large-scale food preparation. These are not the leftovers of quiet domestic life. They are the detritus of ritual feasts, the sensory backdrop to carved stone. Imagine the smell of smoke and roasting meat, the clang of tools, the murmur and then crescendo of voices as elders recite myth, the feel of cold stone under hand during a vow or oath. The stones were not silent memorials, they were active stages in a theater of meaning. We must also consider the possibility that these visual programs served mnemonic purposes. In pre-literate societies, oral knowledge is anchored to place and image. Carved panels could function as memory aids, visual scripts that guide storytelling, calendrical recitation, and ritual choreography. The repeated iconographic motifs allow a dispersed population to share an interpretive framework, even when they returned only occasionally to the same hilltop. In that sense, the stones are both curriculum and archive, durable prompts that structured the community's cosmology and normative knowledge across generations. At the same time, we should resist tidy, single-cause explanations. The richness of the iconography argues for multivalence. Each image likely folded together overlapping meanings, practical, social, and cosmic. A vulture may be an agent of excarnation in one ceremony, a symbol of purification in another, and a clan emblem in a third. Likewise, the headless man may narrate a myth about stolen identity, mark a funerary practice, or enact a cosmological principle about rebirth. The stones do not deliver a single literal message. They are polyvalent texts written to be read in layers by participants whose interpretive context was built into their lives. That polyvalence helps explain why later cultures in the region carried echoes of similar myths. The Mesopotamian and Levantine narrative universe, gardens, flood myths, skyborne beings, underworld journeys, contains motifs that resonate faintly with the carved world. Whether direct cultural inheritance occurred is a matter of debate. Continuity can be broken, reworked, or reimagined across millennia. But the presence of shared narrative themes, death and rebirth, sky journeys, animal-human entanglement, suggests that some fundamental human concerns were being encoded in ritual and image long before writing made those stories portable across space and time. The pillars may be a distant prologue to a much longer story of mythic imagination in the Near East. Finally, we must face the stone's deliberate closure. The same hands that sculpted and staged these images later covered them with earth. That burial is itself a symbolic act that reframes the iconography. To bury a sacred image is to transform its function, from living ritual prompt to sealed relic. Burying the stones could mark the end of a cosmology, a negotiated transition in social organization, perhaps toward agriculture, or an act of protection and sanctification. The images, one's public performance, become a fossilized scripture, sealed but potent, a message to a future that might never read it the same way. The act of burial preserves the polyvalence, but stops the live performance, freezing the stone's meanings into an archaeological silence that we now attempt to speak through. In the end, the carved stones teach humility about interpretation and awe about human imagination. They show a people who thought deeply about life's edges and put those thoughts into stone. Whether the pillars encode a death cult, a sky religion, clan totems, memory devices, or all of these at once, they testify to a capacity that is central to our species: the will to externalize inner worlds, to shape shared meaning, and to appoint certain places as the theater of the sacred. Those stones are our oldest surviving sermons on how to live together in the face of mortality. If you listen carefully, their message is not a map with clear labels. It is an incantation that invites participation. The images demand interpretation, debate, and reimagining. And perhaps that is their deepest power. They refuse to reduce the human condition to a single story. Instead, they offer many possible lines of meaning, each one a thread you can follow into the lives of people who 12,000 years ago stopped and asked, what is worth carving into the world so that it might outlast us?
Whatever its original purpose, the most baffling fact about the site is this. After centuries of careful construction, carving, and ceremony, those same people deliberately buried it. The pillars and enclosures were not left to collapse by chance. They were covered by tons of earth, tamped and arranged in ways that look more like a ritual internment than geological accident. The act raises the sharpest questions we have. Why would a community invest generations of labor into a sacred landscape only to seal it away from the living? Was the burial an act of protection, penitence, performance, or something stranger? The answers are many-layered, and the evidence points in several directions at once. The physical signature of that closure is precise. Archaeologists found stratified fills intentionally poured over the enclosures, layers of small stones, earth, and cultural debris carefully tamped over the bases of the pillars and into the open spaces. The fills contain compacted occupational detritus, broken grinding stones, fragmented flint tools, charred bone, organized in ways consistent with deliberate deposition rather than random sedimentation. Radiocarbon dates from organic material above and within those fills cluster in the early Holocene, suggesting the major episodes of burial occurred after the primary building phases, roughly around the 9th to 8th millennia BCE. Those calibrated dates, repeated in multiple trenches, make accidental burial by wind or flood highly unlikely. This was an act with intention and timing. Why bury? One of the most persuasive explanations frames the closure as a form of ritual decommissioning. Across ethnographic and historical examples, sacred buildings are often ritually closed when a society's cosmology changes, when a cult loses legitimacy, or when a new generation seeks to mark a clean break with the past. Burying a sanctuary can be a way to preserve it from profane use, to retire a ritual tradition, or to transform an active temple into a sealed relic of memory. In that light, the site's burial may have been a final liturgical act, an ultimate ceremony that both honored the place and removed it from the world of ordinary practice. The same hands that raised the stones could also have been entrusted to seal them, perhaps believing the site had fulfilled its purpose or become dangerous if left open. Another influential explanation ties the burial to social and economic transformation. The period after the site's primary use roughly overlaps with the slow spread of domestication and sedentary village life in the region. As groups adopted cultivation and animal management, the rhythms of labor and social organization changed. What had once been a place for episodic aggregation, mass feasting, ritual performance, and seasonal convergence may have lost its centrality in a world of permanent settlements with new priorities: fields to tend, houses to maintain, and local political orders to manage. The ritual mechanisms that had mobilized large seasonal workforces might have been supplanted by agricultural institutions. If so, burying the sanctuary could be a symbolic reallocation of social energy. An old network sealed while a new mode of organization rose. This hypothesis reframes the burial not as destruction, but as cultural redirection. Climate and ecology must also be placed on the table. The last glacial cycle's end and the episode known as the Younger Dryas had already reshaped human livelihoods in the centuries before the monuments were raised. Although the Younger Dryas predates the primary construction at the site, later Holocene climatic variations and local environmental change could have made the hilltop less viable for repeated gatherings. A drying trend, the shift of animal migrations, or local ecological degradation could have reduced the utility of a once strategic place. If hunting yields declined or wild cereals became less reliable, the cost-benefit balance of traveling en masse to a sanctuary would tip toward sedentarization and localized subsistence. And communities might ritually close the site as its practical function faded. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological signals showing changes in exploited species and frequencies lend some weight to this scenario, though the evidence is complex and regionally varied. A darker, though less certain possibility is that the burial reflects socio-political rupture, conflict, contagion, or internal schism. The deliberate sealing of a ritual center could be a response to violence, to hide sacred objects from looting, to infectious disease, to ritually quarantine a place associated with death, or to factionalism, to deliberately bury symbols associated with a losing faction. Archaeological trenches have yielded human bone in some of the fills and evidence of violent trauma on regional skeletons. However, the presence of human remains in fills is not uniform, nor does it definitively indicate catastrophe. The archaeological record resists easy storytelling. It can be read as both cautionary and ambiguous. While conflict can never be ruled out, the organized character of the burial, systematic layering, careful tamping, and apparent ritual deposition fits better with negotiated closure than hurried concealment.
One theory that gained traction with the public, partly because it fits a compelling narrative, is that the builders intentionally sealed their sacred knowledge against future abuse, a deliberate, long-duration time capsule. By burying their sculptures and iconography, the builders could protect the sacred program for later generations, or hide dangerous myths. The symbolic act of burying is itself communicative. It signals an endpoint while preserving legacy. Modern archaeological discovery then becomes an unintended unsealing of that ancient message. It's an attractive idea, poetic and resonant, but we must be careful not to project modern notions of archiving and time capsules onto prehistoric people. The act of burial undoubtedly had meaning, but that meaning was embedded in a cultural logic we can only approximate from the stones and the bones. Recent work complicates simple narratives by showing that the site's role in the landscape may have shifted rather than ended abruptly. New survey and excavation across the region, uncovering related sites, such as Karahan Tepe and others in the so-called Taştepeler horizon, reveal a network of monuments with overlapping iconographies and complementary features. These sister sites show variation. Some present evidence of more domestic activity, others emphasize monumental carving. The presence of multiple centers suggests a distributed ritual landscape where the importance of any single mound could wax and wane over centuries. If the region's ritual geography reorganized, perhaps with emerging villages assuming new ceremonial functions, the burial of one center could be part of a broader relocation of sacred labor, rather than a single cataclysmic event. The technical character of the burial itself is revealing about motives and timing. Some enclosures show careful dismantling of superstructures before fills were deposited. Carved stones were sometimes toppled inward and then covered, an action that looks less like destruction and more like deliberate closure. The sequence suggests planned ceremonies. Remove or neutralize the active components, place offerings or debris in specific patterns, then inter the whole with tamped earth and stones. In a ritual frame, such actions may have been performative acts of cosmological transition, an enacted ending that allowed the community to move from one mythic stage to another. The care suggests respect rather than contempt, and the repeated nature across multiple enclosures implies a shared decision-making process across generations.
Another important line of evidence comes from the distribution of finds within the fills. The deposited material includes not only refuse, but deliberately placed objects, broken tools, selected animal bones, and sometimes fragmented sculptures. Those are classic signatures of ritual deposit. The community is not simply discarding trash, it is composing a symbolic assemblage to accompany the burial. The broken and placed objects may be offerings, votive sacrifices, or symbolic endings for instruments whose service had concluded. The curated nature of such deposits strengthens the argument that burial was a meaningful, culturally prescribed act, an ordinance rather than an accident. Yet despite the weight of ritual explanations, we must be honest about limits. The archaeological record is partial. We read human intentions from pattern and residue. Alternative explanations often rest on fragments. A cluster of bones here, a charcoal date there, a chipped tool in a fill. The best argument for deliberate burial combines archaeological stratigraphy with contextual interpretation and ethnographic analogy, but none of those elements gives us a locked answer. Theories that emphasize ritual closure, socioeconomic shifts, ecological change, and political rupture each capture part of the likely truth. The act of burial may itself be polycausal, an enacted response to multiple converging pressures, new modes of subsistence, changing power forms, environmental shifts, and evolving cosmologies. The interpretive stakes go beyond one hill in Anatolia. If the burial marks a transition from episodic ritual aggregation to village-based social life, it reframes the sequence of social evolution. It supports a model where religious performance, large gatherings, and the social capital from ritual binding may have been primary drivers of social complexity. But it also suggests those mechanisms were mutable, feasible and powerful in one epoch, less so in the next. The burial then becomes a symbolic hinge in human history, an end to one social logic and the beginning of another. Whether that hinge led to settled agriculture, hierarchical polities, or new mythic forms, the decision to bury tells us that ancient people recognized the need for ceremonial closure when the world they knew was changing. Finally, there is an emotional resonance in the burial that connects across 12 millennia. The act of sealing a sacred place is also an act of grief and memory. Imagine elders overseeing the last rites for a sanctuary that had structured the lives of generations. The last feast, the last carving, the last song sung to a sky that would no longer witness those rituals. The tamped earth and broken tools are not merely archaeological data, they are traces of farewell. Whatever modern theory we favor, the burial carries a human core, people choosing to remember, to protect, to end, and to move on. In the end, the vanishing resists a single tidy explanation. Its deliberate character is clear. Its motives are complex, layered, and human. Ritual closure, economic transformation, environmental shifts, political recalibration. Each thread weaves through the archaeological fabric. The burying of the site is less an archaeological footnote than a powerful statement about the fragility and contingency of social forms. Even monumental things, crafted with patience and awe, can be returned to the earth by the people who made them, sealed not by oblivion, but by an act that preserves memory for a future they did not live to see.
Stone can be patient. Carved once, it waits, through generations, droughts, and the slow shifting of human tongues, for someone to touch its meaning again. The pillars on that Anatolian hill did not disappear into silence, so much as fold their language into the long, tangled story of the Near East. When we trace their echoes, we discover not a single line of descent, but a braided set of transmissions, memory refracted through migration, reimagining, and the stubborn human habit of telling origin stories. What the pillars began to say in ritual about death, animals, the sky, and the strange business of being human reappears in later myths and practices across Mesopotamia and the Levant, sometimes faintly, sometimes in altered form, and always transformed by centuries of human conversation. First, a caveat. Archaeologists and the teams who excavate these hills have been careful to resist romantic leaps.
The lead researchers at the original site explicitly warned against equating the mound with specific biblical locations like the Garden of Eden. Such parallels are alluring, but archaeologically speculative. Places and images can resonate without a direct, literal lineage. Still, resonance matters. Cultural memory doesn't require perfect continuity. It needs motifs that can be picked up, retold, and reworked by later storytellers. Let's begin with the most obvious motif: death and the handling of bodies. The carved vulture above headless torsos on one pillar reads to modern eyes like a mortuary scene, an excarnation rite in which birds help carry the body's matter or soul skyward. That practice, or metaphors like it, linger in later cultural repertoires. Across the Levant and Mesopotamia, we find elaborate mortuary rites, ancestor veneration, and textual imaginations of souls moving between earth and sky. In some later traditions, vultures, eagles, and other birds serve as psychopomps, creatures that convey the dead into other realms. Whether the pillar's image is a direct ancestor of a particular myth or a distant relative in a family of metaphors, it participates in a durable human grammar about transformation at death. Next, consider the theme of the fragmented body. The site's repeated imagery of dismemberment and headless torsos is shocking in its recurrence. In neighboring early Neolithic sites, we find plastered skulls and curated human remains, practices that suggest an intense, negotiated relationship with ancestors and bodily integrity. Centuries later, Mesopotamian and Levantine myths dramatize cosmic dismemberment, gods and monsters that must be cut apart, reconstructed, or consumed to create the world or to maintain cosmic order. Stories such as the Sumerian accounts of gods slaying monstrous beings or later myths about a primeval rupture echo that symbolic register: body as world, fragmentation as creative or ritual act. Again, the content is not a direct copy, but a reappearance of a set of symbolic solutions to common human anxieties: mortality, violence, continuity. Animals are the site's most persistent chorus. Predators and scavengers, foxes, boar, vultures, snakes, dominate the iconography. In many societies, animals function as totems, metaphors, or cosmic agents. In the later Near East, animals figure centrally in myth: dragon-like chaos monsters, serpents associated with healing and wisdom, birds as omens. The repeated use of certain species on the pillars suggests a shared symbolic library that could have been legible to dispersed communities over centuries. As groups shifted into villages and towns, those animal motifs could be reframed into creatural characters in longer narratives: gods who take animal form, ancestral beasts, or emblematic clan creatures. The persistence of the animal lexicon is less surprising than the way communities remolded it into story. We should also attend to performance and memory as engines of transmission. The hilltop architecture promoted episodic aggregation, feasts, rituals, and performances that drew people across landscapes. Those gatherings were living classrooms for myths. Songs, chants, and dramatized rituals move faster and farther than pottery styles. They're easily carried by travelers, marriage partners, and traders. When people who had once met at a hilltop later founded villages or moved into river valleys, they carried fragments of ritual and song with them. That intangible heritage could be the bridge between carved stone and later written myth. In this sense, the monuments functioned as mnemonic anchors, place-based prompts for stories that could then be retold without the original stones, perhaps transformed by the necessities of settlement life. By the time written records appear in the region, Sumerian tablets from southern Mesopotamia, Akkadian letters and myths, the landscape of belief is rich and varied. Some themes that show up in those texts mirror the concerns evident on the pillars: questions of order versus chaos, the sanctity and danger of certain animals,
rites of death and protection, and the assertion of place through sacred architecture. Scholars debate whether these are echoes of a continuous tradition or convergent solutions to shared human problems. The balance of evidence suggests a mixture. Some motifs likely traveled with migrating peoples or spread via networks of exchange. Others reoccurred independently because human societies confronted similar existential questions and found similar symbolic tools useful. The discovery of related sites in the broader Stone Hills horizon, newly identified and excavated locations with comparable pillars and iconography, changes the terms of the conversation. Karahan Tepe, Cyberch, and others revealed that the carved hill was not a unique freak of cosmology, but part of a regional repertoire of ritual centers. That network makes cultural transmission more plausible. If neighboring communities share styles, rites, and meeting places, they create a substrate for ideas to travel and recombine. New finds, miniature carved animals, human depictions, and evidence of domestic life at some of these sites show increasingly complex social landscapes where myth and daily life began to interpenetrate. A distributed ritual landscape is a far more fertile seedbed for later mythic elaboration than an isolated sanctuary. A crucial question is timing. How many centuries or millennia must pass for carved motifs to transform into codified myth? The answer is both simple and profound. Long enough for forms to change, short enough for certain motifs to remain recognizable. Oral traditions are flexible. They adapt to new social forms. Consider the way storytellers fold older heroic episodes into new frameworks. Heroes become gods, gods become cultural ancestors, and old place names become mythic landscapes. In the Near East, the shift from mobile ritual aggregation to village life and then to urban states created successive points where myth could be reframed. Each transformation offered fresh reasons to retell old motifs, to explain agricultural cycles, justify territorial claims, or legitimize new political power. Over centuries, a carved vulture could morph into a symbol of purification, then into an omen in a city epic, then into a cautious metaphor in temple hymnody.
Those who want neat labels, this pillar became that myth, therefore X site equals Y legend, will find disappointment here. Instead, the archaeological evidence invites humility and nuance. We can say with confidence that the Tash Tepeler monuments belong to a matrix of ritual innovation that predated and probably helped catalyze social experiments leading to agriculture and settlement. We can also say that motifs from that matrix found their way into broader narrative repertoires across the Near East, though always mediated by local needs and later rewrite. The pillars are not a single origin point for later religions. They are a deep reservoir of symbolic resources that later cultures drew upon, consciously or unconsciously. Another vector of echoing is technological and social. The logistics of gathering, feasting, and coordinated labor developed at the hills provided a template for later collective projects, walls, temples, irrigation works that define urban life. Ritual gatherings taught people how to organize labor beyond the household, who could call a feast, how obligations were recorded socially, and how symbolic leaders could mobilize resources. Those social lessons are the quiet infrastructural echoes that matter as much as any motif in myth. They helped societies learn to cooperate at scale, paving the material ground on which the stories of gods and kings would be written. Political appropriation also shaped echoes. As villages grew into towns and towns into city-states, emerging elites often reinterpreted old myths to anchor their authority. A founding myth that once united seasonal aggregations could be reframed as the origin story of a particular dynasty, with sacred places repurposed and their images reinterpreted to support new claims. Memory is political. Choosing which stones to honor, which stories to retell, and which rituals to keep
is an act of social power. Where later scribes recorded origin tales, they did so from vantage points shaped by new hierarchies and agendas. The pillars' images, once communal prompts, could be carved anew in monumental reliefs that now symbolized state power rather than seasonal fellowship. We should also not ignore discontinuity. Not every motif survives. Not every ritual finds a new life. The burial of the sites itself created breaks. When a sanctuary is sealed, the live contexts that animated its imagery are cut off. Songs lose their stage, prophecies their acoustics. Some memories dissipate, and only fragments move forward. Perhaps a single animal image, a motif of death, a refrain of a chant. Those fragments are like words salvaged from a burned library, telling but partial. Later cultures filled the blanks with new content. This patchwork character is precisely why scholars trace echoes rather than direct lines. The threads are real, but the tapestry is composite. Recent discoveries strengthen the case for transmission without forcing determinism. Karahan Tepe's tiny carved animals and newly documented human sculptures suggest a maturing narrative art, objects deliberately arranged to tell a story. These finds indicate that by the time of Karahan Tepe and its neighbors, storytellers had begun to compose miniature scenes, a precursor to longer narrative forms. That is a significant step. When images are intentionally staged to narrate, the jump to oral epic becomes shorter. The stagecraft of story had become portable. Finally, the echoes across time matter because they humanize deep prehistory. The pillars are not curiosities for specialists. They are the early acts of cultural authorship. They show people experimenting with memory, audience, and meaning in ways we recognize. Their carvings wrestled with the same big questions that later myths answered. How do we live with death? How do we bind groups together? Who or what keeps the world in order? Those questions did not vanish when writing began. They only acquired new forms. Tracing echoes is therefore not an exercise in antiquarianism. It is a way to see the continuity of human concern across millennia. So the echoes are both faint and thunderous. They are faint in the sense that centuries fray details and languages change. They are thunderous because the foundational questions and some of the symbolic tools remain shockingly similar. The carved hill did not become a single, fixed tale, but partook of a long conversation that braided ritual, memory, and myth across generations. Where the stones once stood as stages for communal enactment, their motifs drifted outward, into songs, into household practices, into the grand narratives of empires. Each retelling altered them, but each retelling kept them alive. If we listen closely, the stones still speak, not as straightforward scripts, but as ancestral tones woven into a chorus of later voices. Their echoes remind us that culture is never born whole. It accretes, borrows, and reimagines. The oldest city no one can find did not vanish into oblivion. It dispersed its language into the long story of humanity's search for meaning.
When the stones first emerged from the hill, the world's imagination sprinted ahead of the shovels. Headlines called it the world's first temple. Documentaries framed it as a lost Eden, and a curious public wanted a neat narrative. Here, finally, was the origin of civilization. But archaeology is stubbornly polyvalent. The discovery did not hand over a single meaning. It ignited an argument, rigorous, sometimes rancorous, and utterly necessary, about how we interpret the deep past. This is the debate that shaped the way scholars, journalists, and the public speak about the site. Was it a sanctuary built by ritual specialists, drawing hunter-gatherers together? Or does the evidence instead point to something more complex, an emergent social landscape that includes settlement, seasonal aggregation, specialists, and the early scaffolding of hierarchy? The answer matters because it changes how we understand the origins of social complexity itself.
At the center of the debate sit two competing narratives. The first, associated with the original excavator Klaus Schmidt and many subsequent supporters, frames the hill as a ritual center, a place where mobile groups periodically converge to feast, perform rites, and collaborate on monumental construction. For Schmidt, the pillars are anthropomorphic. The enclosures are stages for ritual, and the butchered bones and smashed grinding stones are the detritus of episodic feasts that financed social cohesion rather than year-round labor. This reading emphasizes ideology and religion as engines of complexity. Shared belief systems generate the motivation for cooperation, which in turn can precede or even catalyze agriculture. The interpretive power of this model rests on multiple lines of evidence: the location and form of enclosures, the dominance of non-domestic debris in early layers, and dating that places monumental architecture before clear, sustained indicators of intensive farming. The second narrative is more cautious and incremental. It observes that the archaeological record is growing richer and that new techniques and excavations complicate the tidy, ritual-first story. Surveys and fresh trenches in and around the hill, combined with geophysical prospection, have revealed domestic features, evidence of cereal processing, water supply systems, and activity areas that look more like occupation than singular ceremonial use. In short, the site may have contained more everyday life than early interpretations allowed, and the apparent absence of domestic debris might reflect sampling bias, differential preservation, or simply the limited scope of early excavations. This model argues for a blended picture. Ritual architecture certainly exists, but it coexisted with growing sedentary practices, craft specialization, and economic transformations that jointly contributed to increasing social complexity. New comparative finds have strengthened the cautionary position. Over the past decade, archaeologists have documented a cluster of similar sites across the region, a constellation sometimes called the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills, which includes Karahan Tepe, Cyberch, and several other enclosures with T-shaped pillars and comparable iconography. These sister sites show a range of behaviors. Some display stronger domestic signatures, others emphasize monumental carving, others contain small artifacts that suggest storytelling in miniature. The existence of a regional network means we must stop treating the hill as a one-off miracle, and instead see it as one node in a dynamic, heterogeneous landscape of ritual and habitation. That context makes it more plausible that social experiments, ritual, exchange, nascent sedentism co-evolved across decades and centuries rather than a single religious breakthrough producing civilization overnight. Radiocarbon dating is the anchor of the whole controversy, and it has been both clarifying and maddening. Multiple AMS dates from charcoal and other organic residues establish that monumental phases on the hill stretch back to near 9600 BCE, certainly early enough to upend old sequences where architecture follows farming. But radiocarbon provides probabilities and calibration curves, not absolute timestamps. And each new date invites fresh nuance. When labs reanalyze short-lived samples or when new contexts emerge with domestic evidence, the temporal relationships shift. The argument is therefore partly methodological. How should we sample? Which materials best reflect construction phases? And how do we avoid conflating episodic use with permanent occupation? Scholars on both sides insist that correct sampling and context are essential. The disagreement is rarely about the dates themselves, and more about how to interpret the pattern those dates create. Another front in the debate is the reading of iconography. Pillar reliefs, vultures, serpents, predators, headless torsos admit many plausible interpretations. For some researchers, the carvings are ritual enactments. Did they represent excarnation rites, mythic narratives, or clan totems? Others caution that iconography can be polyvalent, and that modern viewers may impose symbolic systems that never existed in precisely that form. A recurring worry is projection. Interpreting images through the lens of later Near Eastern myths or religious categories risks teleology, assuming that later written religions descend directly from these images.
The conservative response is to situate the carvings within their immediate material contexts and to favor multiple working hypotheses rather than a single explanatory narrative. But science keeps adding tools to the argument. Isotopic analyses of animal bones and human remains from contemporaneous regional sites help reconstruct diet and mobility. Microbotanical studies, pollen, phytoliths, starch, reveal patterns of plant use. Micromorphology detects trampling surfaces, hearths, and floors invisible to naked eye excavation. Each method refines the picture. For instance, evidence for intense cereal processing and built water management features at nearby locations suggests that agricultural practices and sedentary infrastructures were developing in parallel with monumental architecture. Genomic studies of ancient people from the broader region reveal patterns of mobility, intermarriage, and gene flow that are consistent with wide social networks plausibly used for ritual aggregation, but also for exchange and marriage that underpin longer-term social change. These convergent methods make a mixed model more plausible to many scholars. Ideological and economic drivers were entangled, not sequential.
Public fascination and myth-making add a complicated social dimension. Popular narratives favor big, simple stories. First Temple sells newspapers. Ancestral Eden sells documentaries. Sensationalism flirts with pseudoscience. Fringe authors have seized upon the site to argue for lost advanced civilizations, cosmic calendars pointing to cataclysmic events, or mystical knowledge deliberately buried for posterity. Scientists react with annoyance and, at times, caution. Sensational claims often rest on selective evidence and ignore methodological constraints. The academic community's response has therefore been twofold: to push for careful, transparent publication of data and to engage the public with measured interpretations that convey both wonder and uncertainty. The point is not to dampen imagination, but to protect a fragile record from being overwritten by appealing fictions. Institutional voices matter here too. The international teams now working in the region, Turkish universities, the German Archaeological Institute, local museums, and regional authorities shape what questions get asked and what gets prioritized. Funding, access, and political priorities influence excavation strategies. For instance, conservation concerns and site management sometimes limit the amount of intrusive excavation, while geophysical prospection and non-invasive techniques receive emphasis. UNESCO listing and Turkish cultural policy also shape the discourse. As sites gain heritage designation, narratives that emphasize universality and outstanding value and that resist speculative claims often rise to prominence. That institutional framing can temper sensational narratives, but may also prioritize particular interpretive lines that align with heritage narratives. Critically, the debate is not purely academic, it is methodological and philosophical. It asks fundamental questions about how historians of deep time reason from fragments. Should archaeology prefer the simplest model, ritual center, periodic gathering, when that model explains the lack of domestic debris? Or should it favor complexity, a mosaic of ritual and habitation, when new data consistently reveal domestic traces nearby? The answer is inevitably empirical and provisional. Good archaeology welcomes revision. The narrative that reflexively linked monumental architecture to full-blown states in agriculture has already been revised, but the newer narrative that places ritual at the origin of complexity is itself subject to modification as landscapes reveal domestic life in greater detail. There are also disciplinary debates about what counts as civilization. If the threshold is palaces, writing, and sustained urban administration, then the hill's monumental enclosures are precursors at best. If the threshold emphasizes organized labor, shared symbolism, social institutions capable of mobilizing resources, and durable architecture, then the hill fits more comfortably within the category of emergent complex society. The debate matters not only for semantics, but for how we narrate human capacities. Were our ancestors capable of large-scale coordinated projects long before agriculture, or did agriculture create the surplus that made those projects possible? The hill forces us to admit our categories are porous and historically contingent. New discoveries keep the debate alive. Kara-Hontep's recent finds, including small carved animals and human-like sculptures, push scholars to refine their models of storytelling and social cohesion.
If these sites show staged, miniature narratives and increasing domestic signals, then the story becomes one of coevolution. Narrative art and ritual practices matured alongside, not strictly before or after subsistence changes. Each trench, each AMS date, and each residue analysis is a fresh data point that either nudges the model toward ritual primacy or toward integrated social transformation. The pace of discovery is humbling. The hill that once seemed to invert the causal order of civilization now sits within a growing, complex mosaic of evidence. Finally, the debate illuminates a deeper lesson about history. Human ingenuity rarely follows a straight line. Cultural change is knotty, reversible, adaptive, and experimental. The great debate over the hill is not a quarrel to be permanently won. It's an ongoing collective exercise in how to read the human past responsibly. Archaeology's role is to assemble evidence, test competing hypotheses, and accept ambiguity when the data demand it. Popular narratives will continue to favor icons and origin stories, and that is not inherently bad. What matters is that our public stories be informed by rigorous science, and that our science remains open to the grandeur of human imagination. In the end, both sides of the debate converge on a surprising agreement. The hill matters. Whether you call it a sanctuary, a ritual hub, or a nascent settlement, it demonstrates that people 12,000 years ago could organize, imagine, and inscribe meaning into the landscape in ways that profoundly shaped subsequent histories. The disagreement we see in academic pages and at conference panels is not a failure, but evidence of a living discipline grappling with a discovery that refuses easy storytelling. It is precisely that tension, the oscillation between mythic impulse and scientific discipline, that makes the study of the oldest city no one can find so electrifying. As excavation continues, the debate will sharpen and perhaps won't end in consensus. New methods, ancient DNA, refined microanalysis, expanded regional surveys, and collaborative publication practices will keep refining the picture. For now, the stones sit framed by tarps and scaffolding, their carved faces worn by millennia. They are at once evidence and provocation, proof that humans created the conditions for large-scale cooperation long before empires, and a question about how belief, subsistence, and social organization braided together to make shared worlds. The argument is the work, interpretation is the prize, and every new season of digging is another chance to listen more carefully to the past.
When the first carved pillars rose from the hilltop, archaeologists thought they had stumbled on a singular marvel, an isolated miracle that demanded explanation. But stone does not speak only in isolation. As more excavation and survey opened other mounds across the Anatolian uplands, a different picture emerged. The hill was not a lone island of meaning, but one node in a much larger constellation. What at first looked like a single, inexplicable sanctuary now reads as part of an emergent regional landscape of ritual, symbol, and social experimentation. Understanding that network changes everything. It moves the argument from the exceptional to the systemic, and in doing so, it redraws the map of humanity's first large-scale experiments in shared meaning. The network is not uniform. It is a variegated geography of hills and enclosures, each familiar in form, yet idiosyncratic in detail. Some mounds echo the original site with T-shaped pillars, deep reliefs, and concentric enclosures. Others manifest variations, different scales of carving, altered iconographic repertoires, or closer evidence of domestic activity. This diversity is the key to reading the landscape. Instead of a single temple erected by some singular religious breakthrough, the region reveals repeated experiments in how groups could stage authority, memory, and cooperation. The repeated architectural vocabulary, pillars, benches, focal points, functions like dialects within a broader language of sanctity. Each center learned from and refracted the other's forms, contributing to a regional culture of monument making that spanned generations. Networks require nodes and pathways. The nodes here are the carved enclosures themselves. The pathways are the seasonal routes, kinship ties, and exchange circuits connecting them. Archaeologists reconstruct these pathways through the distribution of exotic materials. Obsidian flakes from distant sources, shell beads carried from coastal zones, and stylistically similar objects found across discrete sites. These materials map a flow of goods and ideas. People moved, not only in the act of migration, but in the repeated, ritualized practice of meeting and exchanging. Seasonal aggregation, groups assembling for feasts, marriages, and rites, functioned as a social infrastructure, allowing innovations in one place to spread to many. The network, then, was both material and mnemonic. It transported meat and obsidian as it carried stories and shared symbols. This regionality also reframes questions about labor and organization. Mobilizing labor at the scale necessary to quarry, carve, and erect monoliths does not require a permanent urban workforce if the labor can be episodic and regional. A project could be staged across seasons: quarry work in one season, hauling in another, carving and ceremony when people aggregated. The network allowed planners to tap into a pool of temporarily available labor drawn from a broad hinterland. This model dissolves the need for an urban core as the sole source of organized labor. Instead, it imagines communities organized as fluid coalitions, linked by marriage, trade, and ritual obligations, that could come together repeatedly for monumental projects. Crucially, different nodes in the network appear to have played distinct social roles. Some mounds emphasize the monumental. The grand pillars and sculpted reliefs dominate the material record, while evidence of long-term domestic life is scant. Other sites show a stronger mix of habitation debris, suggesting places where daily life and sacred performance intermingled. A few centers present items that intimate craft specialization: finely worked stone objects, evidence of prolonged tool maintenance, and concentrations of artistic fragments. These functional differences hint at a division of labor across the landscape. Certain places served as long-term habitation hubs, others as carving shrines, and some as meeting places where artisans, ritual leaders, and traders converged. When we map that division onto social roles, a picture of interdependence appears. Villages that developed around water sources and arable patches might have provided agricultural products or storage capacity. Upland groups, experts at hunting and seasonal resource procurement, might have contributed game and logistical know-how for mass feasts. Artisans and ritual specialists, whether permanently resident in a locality or itinerant between nodes, provided the iconographic and technical skills needed for carving and ritual choreography. Seasonal leaders or revered elders could convene gatherings, direct labor pools, and officiate rites. In this way, the network becomes a socio-economic ecosystem. Each node contributes resources, skills, and authority in a cycle of reciprocal exchange. The existence of multiple ritual centers also reshakes the timeline of cultural exchange. Rather than a single origin radiating outward, we see parallel innovation and iterative borrowing. Architectural forms and iconographic themes appear in multiple places because ideas moved along the same networks that moved obsidian and shell. This helps explain stylistic consistency alongside local variation. Communities adapted common symbolic tools to local concerns, producing regional homogeneity in the broad strokes and local distinctiveness in detail. Over centuries, such processes produce a shared cultural language without necessitating a single hegemonic polity. Another implication of the network model concerns the transmission of ritual knowledge. Rituals survive and spread most effectively when there are repeat encounters, when the same people gather, have the same experiences, and reinforce memory through performance. The carved enclosures provided durable, visible prompts that anchored stories and choreography to place. Yet because gatherings were regional, stories were not confined to one hilltop. They circulated widely, modified by each locality's needs and interpretations. This fluid circulation likely seeded later mythic corpuses across wider geographies. The network, in effect, functioned as a pre-literate broadcasting system. Stones anchored memory locally, while itinerant people transmitted and transformed stories across nodes.
The network also offers a more nuanced view of the process of domestication and sedentarization. Rather than a uniform march from foraging to farming, the landscape appears to host mosaic strategies. In some valleys, nascent agriculture and animal management began to anchor people more permanently. In uplands, seasonal foraging and large-scale feasting retained their utility longer. The network enabled mixed economies. A household could exploit fields in one season and join upland feasts in another, trading agricultural surpluses for social capital and ritual inclusion. This economic interdependence could have smoothed the transition for groups moving toward greater sedentariness by providing complementary resources and social outlets that still satisfied the ritual needs once met by seasonal aggregation. Recent fieldwork across the region has highlighted something crucial: temporal layering. The network was not static, it evolved across centuries. Early phases emphasize monumental carve and feast dynamics. Later phases show increasing signals of domestic architecture and craft specialization. This temporal evolution suggests that the network itself was a laboratory of social change. Nodes shifted emphasis as local ecologies, demography, and social priorities changed. Some centers diminished in importance as nearby villages grew. Others were reinterpreted and reused by successive generations with different social logics. The ritual landscape thus functioned as a long-term arena of experimentation and adaptation, responding to climate shifts, population pressures, and changing subsistence strategies. The archaeology of networks also informs the nature of symbolic coherence across sites. Iconographic parallels, recurring animals, anthropomorphic gestures, and motifs of dismemberment appear at many nodes, but their combinations and emphases vary. In some places, birds dominate the visual register. In others, serpents and predators are central. The differences suggest that while communities shared a symbolic toolkit, they wielded it to express particular local narratives or claims. An animal that functions as a clan emblem in one valley might be a psychopomp in another. These variations create a polyphonic ritual landscape rather than a monolithic doctrine. The polyphony is significant because it demonstrates that social cohesion across the network did not require uniform belief. Rather, it relied on the ability to dialogue across difference through shared performance and periodic convergence. Political implications follow naturally. Networks of ritual centers create arenas for negotiated authority, not necessarily centralized rule. Influence could be situational. A revered ritual leader might command attention across a broad swath of nodes without establishing permanent coercive power. Authority could be performed and reinforced through ceremony rather than enforced through permanent institutional structures. That fluidity may have been both a strength and a weakness, allowing for creative cooperation while making sustained, centralized coordination harder. Over time, as sedentarization gathered pace and local resource control became more critical, forms of authority that could manage day-to-day affairs, those that could administer water, land, and storage, likely gained increased significance. This shift could explain why some ritual centers were eventually buried. Institutions that once knit mobile networks together were less adaptive to settled administrative needs. The network perspective also illuminates how cultural memory survives and morphs. Burial of major sites, intentional interment of enclosures and sculptures may be read not as the end of ritual memory, but as a transformation. Places became dormant reserves of symbolic capital. Buried stones, sealed with deliberate deposits, could serve as reference points for later reactivation or as foundational relics that later communities could claim as ancestral property. In some cases, sites appear to have been reused centuries later in different ritual configurations, suggesting that memory, once sealed, could be reactivated under new social circumstances. This pattern, alternating between active use,
burial, and later reuse gives the network a multi-generational depth of memory that significantly shapes cultural continuity. Finally, reading the region as a network helps resolve some of the paradoxes that earlier single-site interpretations produced. Monumental architecture in a pre-agricultural context seemed anomalous until we realized that the labor and social coordination could be spread across an expansive, seasonally aggregated population. Iconographic similarity across distances becomes logical when we acknowledge the pathways of trade and ceremony that linked communities. The timing contradictions, monuments preceding clear agricultural signatures in one place, become less puzzling when we see that agricultural practices could be present in some nodes and absent in others, producing a mosaic of development rather than a single uniform process. In the end, the hidden network reframes the oldest city no one could find. It was never a single metropolis in the modern sense, but a distributed cultural system, a constellation of sacred hills, seasonal gatherings, specialists, and reciprocal obligations that together created large-scale cooperation without cities. That system generated durable symbols and communal practices that could be passed from one generation to the next and across space, laying down social templates that would later be adapted into settled village life and eventually states. As we stand among the scattered pillars and walk the faint tracks that likely once linked these sites, what becomes clear is the creativity of human social organization. People who lacked writing and metallurgy nonetheless built durable networks of meaning, coordinated vast projects of labor, and composed shared repertoires of myth and ritual. The region's stone hills are the fossilized outline of those networks, monuments not just to belief, but to a profound capacity, the ability to invent institutions of cooperation that could scale beyond the household long before cities had names.
At the summit of that wind-scoured plateau, where pillars once framed the dawn, the earth now sleeps over everything. The stones lie in silence beneath the soil, but they are not gone. They have become part of the planet's memory, the deep archive that outlasts language, empire, and belief. In burying their creation, the builders of Göbekli Tepe and its sister hills may have done more than close a chapter. They preserved a message for the distant future, that long before the first kings, before the first words were written in clay, human beings already knew how to dream together. This, perhaps, is the most humbling truth the stones have given us. Civilization did not begin with bureaucracy, conquest, or the counting of grain. It began when imagination became collective, when hundreds gathered under open skies to carve their questions into rock. They came not because they needed to, but because they believed something should be built, a place where the world of flesh could speak to the unseen. Every cut on those pillars is an act of faith, faith that meaning could be shared, that time could remember, that humanity could leave a trace more durable than itself. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe is not merely a ruin, it is a mirror. It reflects the very structure of human ambition, to gather, to create, to commemorate, and to mourn. The people who built it were not our primitives, they were our prototypes. They understood that the act of creation binds people across generations, that labor can be sacred, and that the search for connection with forces beyond comprehension is as old as the human mind. What they built out of stone, we now build out of glass and code, yet the impulse is the same. We still raise monuments to remember, to believe, to belong. We still carve symbols, hoping that someone, somewhere in the far future, will understand who we were. The oldest city no one can find, then, is not lost at all. It lives wherever people choose meaning over survival, art over utility, memory over oblivion. It is in every story told around firelight, every temple and classroom, every moment we reach backward to understand our beginnings. 12,000 years ago, on a nameless hill above the Fertile Crescent,
humanity stood at the threshold of history and carved its soul into stone. Then, in an act both mysterious and merciful, it buried its creation. Perhaps so that one day, when the world was ready, we could unearth it and remember what it means to be human.